first of all, you have to acknowledge, I'm happy to acknowledge, that it is a historic piece of legislation. It is an extraordinary range of new programs, important programs from climate change to pre-K to all sorts of things that we desperately need in this country. And so I'm all for the idea of leaning in on these issues. The question is, how do you lean in on them in a way that's fiscally responsible? The White House has been saying that the bill is revenue neutral, deficit neutral over the long term. That is sort of technically true, but there are two big asterisks, and let's take a look at those two big asterisks. One of them is what happens over that 10-year period. And so what you can see here is when you break it down year by year, you get spending occurring more in the early years, i.e. creating more deficits, and while the revenues come in the later years. Some of us are old enough to remember that Popeye cartoon in which Wimpy says, "I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today," and that's a little bit of what you see going on here. And this is particularly concerning because we are running a higher inflationary economy at the moment, and so to add $150 billion plus or minus to the deficit each of the next 5 years is simply adding to the inflationary pressures on our economy.
One of the toughest parts of being a bartender, I am told, is figuring out who's drunk and who's just stupid. And I feel a little bit like a bartender in trying to figure out the Biden administration and inflation. On the one hand, inflation is waterboarding in the American people. You practically have to arrange a bank loan to fill up your gas tank. What's causing it? As any economist with a pulse will tell you, President Biden is spending too much money and he's borrowing too much money. That's the classic definition of inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods. So what's the president's solution? The other day I said that the Biden administration, I've observed, never makes the same mistake twice. They make it 5 or 6 times just to be sure. Here's the president's solution to inflation, which he has caused by spending too much and borrowing too much. Let's spend even more and let's borrow even more. He is trying to pass this Build Back Better bill, which is just a spending and borrowing orgy of epic proportions. $4 trillion of new spending, $2 trillion of new debt, $2 trillion of new taxes, and it's going to be like throwing kerosene on a tire fire. Now, I wish...
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wish I could tell you it's going to get better, but the water's not going to clear up until we get the pigs out of the creek. and I don't see my Democratic friends doing anything differently in solving inflation on their own. My party's just going to have to take back Congress if we want to end inflation. That's the way I see it.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak in opposition to the National Defense Authorization Act. As written, this legislation authorizes $778 billion in defense spending just for next year alone. That is more money than we spent on defense during the Korean or Vietnam Wars. It is even more money than we spent at the height of the extraordinary Reagan defense buildup in the 1980s. Now, Congress is set to pass this bill with virtually no debate and with virtually no discussion about how much money we're spending. Congress keeps the spigot of cash wide open so long as it's for defense. And please note that not one single dollar of this huge defense budget will be offset either with new taxes or with new spending cuts someplace else. Meanwhile, do you know how much money the president's Build Back Better plan will cost on average each year if Congress passes it? $175 billion. That is about 1/5 the size of this defense bill. And unlike this defense bill, every single dollar of the president's plan will be offset with new revenue or savings. But here's the thing. When we want to invest $175 billion a year on child care and paid family leave and expanding access to health care and fighting the climate crisis, and when we're going to offset every single dollar for those new expenses, everybody suddenly becomes so very concerned about spending. When we want to make investments that directly benefit people across this country, we're told that costs too much, or that's socialism. But when we spend nearly 5 times that amount of money in the defense bill, it is just a shrug of the shoulders. Look around this chamber. It is empty. And let's be clear where most of this defense money is going. It's largely going to the defense industry. The Pentagon will take this money and give approximately $400 billion to contractors. That's nearly 40% that will go, and nearly 40% of that will go to a handful of giant contractors. This is a huge amount of money in an ordinary year. But 2 years into a global pandemic that's killed 765,000 Americans, it is irresponsible to spend this much money on stuff that isn't saving Americans from what's actually killing them. America's spending priorities are completely misaligned, and the threats Americans actually are facing, the things that are quite literally endangering their lives like COVID-19 and the climate crisis, don't get this kind of attention. Let me be clear. We can spend far less money on defense and still protect Americans and American interests. And you don't have to take my word for it. The Congressional Budget Office recently published a report outlining three different avenues for cutting $1 trillion in defense spending over the next decade. None of the three proposals were even close to radical. And by the way, none of them achieved any savings from nuclear modernization, contract spending, and closing bases. And before somebody cranks up the outrage machine, let me say I do not believe that we should spend nothing on defense. There are real threats to our nation and real interests that we must defend. There are some situations that may require military solutions, but this defense bill goes far beyond that threshold. This bill continues to feed into the wrong-headed idea that America's strength can only be measured by our military domination. This bill is another example of Congress granting the Pentagon virtually unlimited resources while, at the exact same moment, pinching pennies on things that will make the American economy work for our children and for our seniors, for workers and students and retirees, for everyone who isn't part of a tiny little slice at the top. These misplaced priorities chip away at the strength of our nation, and ironically, they undermine the foundation upon which our military is built. If we don't come to recognize this soon, then all this money will have been wasted, and the world's most powerful military will rest on a foundation of sand. There are important and valuable provisions in this defense bill. There are even places where we should spend more money, like on cyber defense. But it is long past time for us to rationalize the Pentagon's budget and align it with the threats we actually face. And this defense bill, like so many before it, fails miserably to do that. For that reason, I will vote against it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
We needed legislation that meets the moment. And meeting the moment means leaving no worker, no family, no community behind in order to truly build back better. We can and should be investing in our crumbling infrastructure in our crumbling roads, as well as investing in our crumbling housing stock. And that's what will happen now with the Build Back Better Act. This are unprecedented investments, and I'm not ceding any ground. We should not take our foot off the gas here. I'm confident the president will secure the votes necessary to pass this. But again, we're going to keep the pressure up because these investments are historic and sorely needed and long overdue. Investments like home and community-based services to address a wait list that is thousands long for services for the disabled and the elderly. Expansion of Medicare to include hearing, the lowering of prescription drug costs, investments in universal pre-K, in childcare, and also ensuring that we're supporting that workforce. What we've done with childcare here is for most families, they won't be paying more than 7% of their income for childcare, which is about the stabilization of our families and our workforce. But we have to take care of those childcare workers too. 30% of them are women of color, and 1 in 6 of them live in poverty. That is simply unconscionable that they are taking care of our babies, putting them on a pathway to a successful life trajectory, but they can't take care of their own. And paid leave. At some point, all of us will need to care for a loved one, or we will need to be cared for. And so those 4 weeks of paid leave, Medicare expansion, including hearing, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, historic investments in housing. My legislation, tenets of that is included in there. Down payment for equity, which will make it great strides in closing the racial wealth gap by growing Black home ownership was the lowest it's been in 6 decades. So I'm not ceding any ground. You know me. The movement will not cede any ground. We're going to keep fighting to make sure that these historic investments that we fought for, that are wildly popular because they are so sorely needed to meet the moment and to meet the needs of the people, of every worker, of every family, and every community.